Picture this. It's lunchtime in America, the mid-90s. The line is out the door, the smell of fresh bread fills the air, and sandwich lovers are flocking to a place that, at the time, felt unstoppable. Not Subway, not Quiznos. Something else, something you might barely hear about today, Blimpie. So what happened? How does a brand that once rivaled the biggest sandwich chains in the country quietly fade into the background? Why did Blimpie, once a household name, lose its grip while competitors surged ahead? Because this isn't just a story about sandwiches. It's about timing, strategy, missed opportunities, and decisions that slowly changed everything. Let's rewind. Back in 1964, three friends in Hoboken, New Jersey, Tony Conza, Pete DiCarlo, and Angelo Baldassari, had a simple idea. They wanted to bring something different to the sandwich world. At the time, deli-style subs weren't exactly dominating fast food. Burgers ruled, pizza was rising, but sandwiches? Not quite. They opened a small shop and named it Blimpie, inspired by the shape of their subs, kind of like a blimp. It was quirky, memorable, and honestly, a little weird. But it worked. From the very beginning, Blimpie positioned itself as something slightly more authentic, more deli-like, fresh meats sliced in front of you, a step above your typical fast food joint. And people noticed. Throughout the 1970s, Blimpie quietly expanded, not explosively, but steadily. They leaned into franchising early, which helped them grow without massive corporate overhead. By the late 70s and early 80s, they were opening stores across the Northeast. And here's the thing, at that time, they were ahead of the curve. Fast, customizable sandwiches? That wasn't everywhere yet. Blimpie had found a sweet spot between convenience and quality. But things didn't stay that way. As the 1980s rolled in, Blimpie hit its stride. This was their first real rise, the moment when they started looking like a serious contender in the fast food world. Stores were popping up across the country. Their branding became more recognizable, and most importantly, they had momentum. By the early 1990s, Blimpie had over 1,000 locations. Let that sink in. At a time when competition was still developing, Blimpie had a massive head start. In fact, for a while they were considered the second largest sub-sandwich chain in the United States, right behind Subway. And if you were around back then, you probably remember, it felt like Blimpie was everywhere. Their stores had a certain charm, a bit more deli, a bit less assembly line. They marketed freshness before it became an industry buzzword, and they had loyal customers who swore by their subs. So naturally, the future looked bright. But this is where everything changed. Because while Blimpie was growing, Subway was evolving. And that difference would slowly, but decisively, reshape the entire industry. You see, Subway made a critical decision that Blimpie didn't fully embrace: aggressive, hyper-scalable franchising. Subway lowered the barrier to entry for franchise owners. Their model made it easier and cheaper to open new locations. And as a result, Subway expanded at an almost unbelievable pace. Thousands of stores, then tens of thousands. Meanwhile, Blimpie's growth, while steady, wasn't nearly as aggressive. Their franchise system was more restrictive, more controlled, which sounds good in theory, but in practice, it meant they simply couldn't keep up. And here's the part that's kind of painful. Blimpie had the early lead. They had the brand recognition, the head start, the loyal customers. But they didn't scale fast enough. And in fast food, speed matters. A lot. As Subway exploded across the globe, Blimpie started to feel the pressure. Suddenly, they weren't the obvious choice anymore. They were just another sandwich shop. And then came the late 90s. What happened next was shocking. Blimpie began to decline. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily, and quietly. Locations started closing, growth stalled, and their presence began to shrink. Part of the problem was competition, not just from Subway, but from emerging chains like Quiznos, which introduced toasted subs and a more premium feel. Suddenly, the sandwich space wasn't just about convenience anymore. It was about innovation, differentiation, experience. And Blimpie? They struggled to redefine themselves. Their branding started to feel outdated. Their menu didn't evolve as quickly as others. And perhaps most importantly, they didn't have a clear identity anymore. Were they premium? Were they fast food? Were they deli-style? It became unclear. And in business, when customers don't know what you stand for, they move on. By the early 2000s, Blimpie was in trouble. Store counts were declining, financial performance was shaky, and the brand that once felt like a rising star was now fighting just to stay relevant. But here's the thing about struggling companies. Sometimes they get a second chance. And Blimpie did. In 2006, the company was acquired by Kahala Corp, a larger franchise operator that owned multiple food brands. This was supposed to be the comeback. A fresh start, new leadership, new strategy. And for a moment, it seemed like things might turn around. Kahala tried to streamline operations. They looked at ways to modernize the brand. There were efforts to refresh the menu, improve store designs, and make the business more franchise-friendly. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a step. And for a brief period, Blimpie stabilized. But here's the reality. The market had already moved on. By this point, Subway had completely dominated the sandwich space. Newer concepts were emerging. Fast casual dining was becoming the trend, with brands focusing on quality, atmosphere, and customization. Think about chains like Jimmy John's or even Panera Bread. They weren't just selling sandwiches, they were selling an experience. And Blimpie? They were still trying to figure out where they fit. This is where everything changed, again. Because instead of a dramatic collapse, Blimpie entered a kind of quiet fade. No massive scandal, no headline-grabbing bankruptcy, just slow, steady disappearance from the spotlight. Locations continued to close over the years. From over 1,000 stores at its peak, the number dropped significantly. Today, only a fraction remain. And if you ask someone under a certain age about Blimpie, there's a good chance they've never even heard of it. That's how quickly relevance can fade. But here's an interesting twist. Blimpie never fully died. It still exists, still operates, still serves sandwiches to loyal customers who remember what it once was. In fact, in some areas, it still holds a nostalgic charm. A reminder of a different era in fast food, before everything became hyper-optimized and globally standardized. And maybe that's part of its identity now. Not a giant, not a trendsetter, but a survivor. Which brings us to today. Blimpie is no longer competing at the top level. It's not trying to outpace Subway or reinvent the sandwich experience. Instead, it exists in a quieter space, smaller, more niche, and largely out of the mainstream conversation. And honestly, there's something a little bittersweet about that. Because when you look back, you realize this was a company that had everything it needed to dominate. The timing, the concept, the early momentum. But it missed a few key turns, didn't scale fast enough, didn't adapt quickly enough, didn't redefine itself when the market changed. And in business, those small gaps can turn into massive consequences. So what's the lesson here? Maybe it's this. Being first doesn't guarantee you'll win. Growth matters, adaptation matters, and sometimes the difference between leading the market and disappearing from it comes down to decisions that don't seem that big at the time. It makes you wonder, if Blimpie had franchised more aggressively, if they had rebranded earlier, if they had leaned into innovation instead of tradition, would things be different today? Would we be talking about Subway's decline instead? Or was this always inevitable? Because in the end, Blimpie's story isn't just about sandwiches. It's about how quickly the world can move past you, even when you were once ahead of everyone else. So next time you pass by a Blimpie, if you even see one, take a second to think about that. A brand that once stood at the top, now quietly holding on. And maybe ask yourself, who's next? Which company today looks unstoppable, but might be telling a very different story 10 or 20 years from now? Let me know what you think. Do you remember Blimpie? Do you think they could ever make a comeback? Or is it too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take.